So good afternoon. My name is Todd Fresner. I'm the director of UCLA Center for Jewish Studies and professor here in Germanic Languages and Comparative Literature. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who has actually been with us the entire year as the Viterbi visiting assistant professor of Mediterranean Jewish Studies. A couple of words about Andrew Berns. He's been really a wonderfully dynamic presence over the past year, and I've had the chance to get to know him this year through his teaching and his appearance at many of our center's events over the past year. And I admire him tremendously as a young scholar and someone who's contributed greatly to our center over this past year. Andrew finished his PhD in 2011 in history from the University of Pennsylvania. And his dissertation was called The Natural Philosophy of the Biblical World, Jewish and Christian Physicians in Late Renaissance Italy. His work spans history of medicine, Renaissance intellectual history, and early modern European history, particularly Jewish and Christian interactions and history of science. It's wonderfully interdisciplinary, and even as you can see on the program for today, he looks as much at texts as maps, visual material, written material, and is, as I said, a really dynamic thinker. Next year, he has a postdoctoral fellowship where he'll be in Florence at a program administered through Harvard University, Villa Etati. And after that, he'll be taking up a tenure-track teaching position at the University of South Carolina at Columbia in history. We've been very fortunate to be able to have the program, the Viterbi program in Mediterranean Jewish history here at UCLA for many years, and being able to have a scholar in residence the entire year. This is actually the first time that we've been able to do that. In years past, we've had someone come for a few weeks at a time. But this year we had the idea that if they could stay the entire year, they could contribute more, and I think that's certainly really borne out with the case with Andrew's work here this year. So what we've asked him to do is give a summary of his talk. So basically speak for about 20 or 25 minutes. The full paper, which is much longer, is available in the back, so in case you want to read it at home afterwards, you should feel free to take a copy with you. And then we have about till 1:30 or so for discussion, Q&A, and you should feel free. There's a sumptuous, as you know, sumptuous buffet in the back, so you should feel free to eat it all, or else it goes home with me and my son. So thank you. Which is a home paradise, right? So without further ado, let me introduce to you Andrew Berns. Thank you.
My instinct was to go to the podium where I usually speak from, but since my name is here, I can't possibly speak from there. Can you all hear me? Is the mic on? Yes. Okay, good. I'll try to project. I have a tendency to both speak quietly and speak very quickly, so I will try to do neither of those things. Anyway, Todd, thank you very much for that exceedingly warm introduction, and whatever benefits I brought to UCLA, the benefits I've received from UCLA have been much, much greater. So it's with a profound sense of gratitude and humility that I thank both Todd and the entire staff of the Center for Jewish Studies, David Wu, Vivian Hollenbeck, Brianna Desmond, Mary Pinkerton, and so forth for their support, not only leading up to this presentation, but also throughout the entire year here. I also want to thank the History Department, which has been my home throughout this academic year, and from whose professors I've learned a tremendous amount. And finally, Andrew Viterbi, who is here in the audience today, whose vision and generosity made not only this modest piece of research possible, but also the entire program that brought me to UCLA for the year. Am I still audible, by the way? Bring it closer?
Yeah, higher.
Higher. I don't think it goes higher. I think it's yeah. I could speak from the podium. Would that? Yeah. Would that complicate the recording? Data?
No.
Okay. I'll do that. My students know that when I tend to get excited about something, I like to stand, so this will just propel me forward with the presentation. I'm aware of the fact that there was a pre-circulated paper that I hope some of you have had a chance to read, perhaps slightly more of you have had a chance to peruse it, but in the event that you haven't had a chance to peruse it, I'm going to do my best to summarize the arguments of the paper, read a few representative quotations, tell you a bit about my own scholarly agenda more generally, and then open it up for discussion really as quickly as possible, because I'd much rather hear from all of you than drone on endlessly. So, as Todd Presner said very eloquently and very concisely, my work focuses on the intellectual and cultural history of Jews in Renaissance Italy. And I'm especially interested in contacts between Jews and Christians. So how did a very conspicuous religious minority, that is to say the Jews, interact with the dominant religious group in Italy at the time, Catholics? And in general, one of the things I try to do throughout my work is to explain intellectual phenomena in a way that's as holistic as possible, and that moves beyond what I call sort of somewhat derisively bookish approaches to intellectual history. So I'm interested in how readers read texts, which is very important in terms of the transmission of ideas, but I'm equally interested in structural, cultural, and social transformations that have as profound, if not a more profound, influence on how ideas develop. So my dissertation, which I'm currently revising into a book project, tries to do just that sort of thing. And it asks, why were so many doctors in Renaissance Italy so acutely interested in the Bible? And then it poses two subsidiary related questions. One, why were they so keen to use their knowledge of natural philosophy and their medical expertise to explain the Bible? And conversely, why did they think the Bible could help them in their medical and scientific practice? And the answers that I propose to that interlocking set of problems are somewhat diverse. I talk about curricular changes in Italian medical schools. I talk about social systems such as colleges and physicians, the ancestors of which are still alive in some American cities today, and which in the 16th century, in some Italian cities, like Mantua, for example, welcomed Jewish as well as Christian physicians. I also talk about courts in early modern Europe as a site where Jews and Christians communicated and exchanged ideas, and also unprecedented epidemiological problems, plagues and so forth, that called forth a need for new cures and new ways of addressing those problems. So in this project, which some of you have read and which I'm discussing today, I've tried to do a similar thing. I've noticed a phenomenon, and I'm trying to explain this phenomenon by understanding things that were going on around it. So what is the phenomenon? The phenomenon is the single northern Italian Jew, probably a Venetian, named Judah Saltaro, wrote a 160-page manuscript composition called Sefer Sha'arei Gan Eden, or the Book of the Gates of the Garden of Eden. And he says a lot of things in 160 pages, but the one thing that I stress and that I selected for my analysis was a passage in which he identifies the distinguishing feature of Eden, paradise, as its fertility, as the lushness of its vegetation, as the salubriousness of its comestible products. And then I asked myself, okay, why is he dwelling on that? Why is that significant? In an age like ours, where we're absolutely obsessed with diet and regime, I was surprised to see that the Renaissance was one of the earliest periods that resembles ours in this respect. So, for those of us who are my age and younger, we can hardly remember a time before Whole Foods was an option, and before diet books were on all supermarket shelves, not to mention Barnes & Noble or on Amazon. But for those in the audience who are older than I am, you can all remember a time when Whole Foods didn't exist. And this craze for organic produce and for healthy eating is very much a late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon, or is it? I do not think that it was. And I think that a variety of publications of books of natural philosophy and books of dietetics at the time that Saltaro was writing, or in the generations immediately before, make that connection very clear between an obsession with health, healthy eating, fruits and vegetables, and eventually why the Garden of Eden was an ideal repository for those things. And as I began to dig, I found that the phenomenon was much broader than just this one Italian Jew, Judah Saltaro. One of the things, parenthetically, that I try to do throughout my work is not focus on one individual and not write heroic biographies of people, however interesting or compelling their stories and their thought may be. What I try to do instead is identify clusters that share certain common denominators. And in this case, as I began to work further, I found that Jews like Yechiel of Pisa, Ovadia Sforno, and Judah Saltaro, not to mention Abraham Farasol, the list could go on, a number of Italian Jews of this generation had a very similar approach to the Garden of Eden, and saw it not as a theologically created or mandated reality, but instead as a physical entity who whose uniqueness and whose impact can be measured by understanding its natural properties, specifically, again, the salubriousness of its produce. The first thing I had to ask myself, and that I think that anybody should ask themselves when dealing with an early modern Jewish intellectual, and for those not in the know, when I say early modern, I mean roughly 15th to 18th century, is how did they come upon this knowledge? Where did this idea come from that the garden was a lush place where really healthy fruits and vegetables grew? And the first place I think a scholar of the Jews has to look is not only at what contemporary Jews are saying, but what Jews in the past were saying. And sure enough, Saltaro cites Maimonides at considerable length, and Maimonides was in some ways an obvious choice. He was, as I assume virtually all of you know, a physician, in the 12th century, who was known to later Jews not only as a juridical authority and as a theologian, but also as a medical writer. Furthermore, there are other pre-modern Jewish sources that the 16th century figures I study could have turned to. Nachmanides pops up, and there is a lengthy quotation from him in this paper and relevant citations. And there are also the classical sources, most conspicuously various Midrashim and also the Babylonian Talmud. But the problem is, I encountered two difficulties. One, even though a voice like Maimonides, or Nachmanides for that matter, may have germane intelligence to offer on the subject of the garden's natural properties, that intelligence was buried in abstruse theological tracts. And I mean no disrespect when I say abstruse, but when we think about the source for Maimonides' quotation, it comes from a very dense, very technical introduction to a theological tractate, in which he discusses such issues as, when the souls come back from the dead, where are they physically all going to be? How are they all going to be in the earth? If it's a physical resurrection, and not just a spiritual one, then how can the planet accommodate all those bodies? So these are sort of very, I think we can all agree, theological and imaginative endeavors. However, to say something in plain language about the fact that the fruits and vegetables were why Adam and Methuselah lived so long was something plucked, so to speak, a little bit out of context. The other problem or reality with these pre-modern Jewish sources is that the descriptions weren't particularly vivid. And the more I looked at Talmudic sources and Midrashic sources, even though there may have been quick mentions of fruits and vegetables, that was never really the point. The point was what the world to come is going to be like. I'm glad the sun has come out, because I was going to speak of the California influence on this project. The idea was more, what does paradise look like? What do the thrones of the righteous sit upon resemble, and so on and so forth. So when I saw that the Jewish sources were not sufficient for people like Farisol, Dapiza, Saltaro, and so forth, it occurred to me that there were probably other things afoot in their culture. And indeed there were. There were at least three things. One, there were a collection of medieval theological and poetic writings, Isidore of Seville on the one hand, Dante on the other, who all gave very clear and eloquent voice to what paradise probably looked like. Second, there were natural philosophical writings, by which I mean the study of the natural world. Natural philosophy is just the pre-modern way of saying natural science. And some of those writings, even though they were couched in a very technical, bookish Latin, penetrated in various ways to other strata of the population. And third, there was an explosion of writings about the New World. And the New World was an object of fascination to 15th and 16th century Europeans for a lot of reasons. One of them, not the most important, but one of them, was because many explorers went to the New World and were amazed at what they saw as its lush, salubrious vegetation. I looked outside and mentioned California because I want to say on a slightly personal note that this project wouldn't have been possible to write outside of California. I mean that not just as another nod to the Viterbi family and to the Center for Jewish Studies and UCLA, although I do, but because I've been living in a place where there is a continual growing season all year round, and I've been blessed to work in very beautiful scenic locations, it has helped me constantly be in this mindset of paradise, where it is, how we might get to it, and so forth. John Steinbeck in East of Eden put the following words into a farmer's mouth. He's coming from Connecticut to the Salinas Valley south of San Francisco, and he says, quote, "Things grow so fast in California, they say you have to plant and step back real quick or you'll get knocked down." So it's certainly in this cultural world that I began to think about this notion more clearly, and I hope more effectively. One other statement with regard to background, I mentioned Saltaro, the sort of star of this paper, whose manuscript forms its foundation. His manuscript is in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and 2 years ago, as a fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, I had the great fortune to sit and really study it carefully, but it's only been here that I've been able to push the analysis further and develop it. 2 more things I'd like to do in the time that I have remaining. One, I'd like to read some representative quotations to you from this paper, and then I'd like to just sketch out some of the bigger claims that I'm making in this project. I don't want to walk you through the paper step by step. I don't want to give you sort of précis of it, but I want to give you a flavor of the language and of the content of these quotations, and then I will sketch out some broader thoughts about what's going on here. The first quotation I'd like to read is from Saltaro himself, and for those of you who have the paper in front of you, it begins on page 5, and it carries over into page 6. I haven't isolated it as a long format quotation, it's chopped up a little bit, but I will read it to you. For we clearly see how below the equator they sow seeds and harvest and plant, as well as how produce is brought forth the entire year, even 3 or 4 times each year. Again, a very Californian idea. Under the equator they have, Saltaro wrote, all the different kinds of produce that we pluck only once each year. There the produce is of different and elevated qualities in terms of its beautiful appearance and pleasant taste, of all sorts. In Saltaro's words, if it were not for the fact that I do not know how to prolong my remarks, I would have related to you astonishing things with regard to the natural history of that land, especially concerning produce, vegetables, lagoons, trees, and grasses, at all times, in every season, and throughout the Garden of Eden. And as you can see, as the quotation continues, he goes on to talk about the quality of the air, the fact that there is dew every night, and he points, again, fundamentally, to ecological, environmental, and natural reasons for what made the Garden of Eden so spectacular and so unusual. Now, he wasn't the only one. Ovadia Sforno, the Bolognese Rosh Yeshiva, or director of the academy in Bologna, who was also a physician, had a gloss on Genesis chapter 6, where he says, not note this as good as I should. It's on the bottom of page 7 onto the top of page 8. There's that verse in Genesis 3:6, where the Bible states, when the woman saw that the tree was good for eating. And many commentators dwell on the fact that the serpent fooled her and misled her into taking from that tree and then giving it to Adam to eat. Sforno had a very different gloss. He says that more earthly concerns lay at the heart of her decision. First of all, she recognized, in Sforno's language, that the tree was, quote, pleasant to eat on account of the nature of the place and the air and the scent of the fruit. Now, I'm already aware that one simple comeback to what I'm saying here is that, okay, that's one sentence with relatively vague and precise language. How can you construct this huge interpretive edifice based on one simple line? Well, for 2 reasons. One, because it fits into a much broader context of similar remarks about the Garden of Eden and its nature, and also because precisely because he ignores those other explanations and those other reasons that many medieval commentators dwell on. Another issue that comes out in these quotations I'd like to read to you today is the question of longevity of life. And this is another one of those concerns very closely tied to dietetics. Why do we want to eat well? We want to eat well to live longer. Why do we want to live longer? To enjoy life more, right? And this is a preoccupation not only of the Jewish intellectuals, physicians or non-physicians of the period, but also natural philosophers, explorers, conquistadores, and so on and so forth, who were all interested in getting the most out of life and stretching their own lifespans as much as they possibly could. So the other longish quotation I want to read to you is from Yechiel of Pisa, a Jew who wrote extensively on a number of philosophical and literary matters, but whose work was not published until a member of the Wissenschaft des Judentums in late 19th century Germany published it. And Yechiel of Pisa, who was, I should say, it's very important, was a banker and a merchant and a man of affairs. This was no ivory tower academic. And somehow, in the midst of all of his busy business activities, he still had time to write a very sophisticated work of philosophy, and he made the following observation: that the bodies of those who eat in Eden, that Pisa maintained, and this is on page 9, pardon me, do not decay, and there is no doubt that the air is more praiseworthy and exalted for being underneath the equator, as all the sages of cosmographia agree, and you can look at my footnote for what cosmographia is all about. The inhabitants of that place do not experience corporeal change, and the exalted rabbi, the Ramban, may his memory be a blessing, already enlarged upon this matter in his book Torah Ta'adam, in the section called Sha'ar HaGemul. The earlier sages who lived close to this climate, even though they were outside the Garden of Eden, lived a long life due to the quality of the air and the plants there, as well as the fine and pure produce and grasses and waters, perfect in merit. Once men began to leave the temperate climate and spread out into the world, their nature changed due to the deterioration in the air, produce, and waters, and their lives were cut short. Now, this notion that at one point men lived so long not because God graced them, but because they ate well, immediately catapulted me in several different directions. I started thinking about the 13th and early 14th century Paduan natural philosopher Pietro d'Abano, who, in his Latin work, the Conciliator, or Conciliator, argues at length in a number of chapters, about longevity of life. And he asks, is it possible to live longer? And of course the answer is yes, you have to eat better. But it's not that simple. It's not one of these diet books that you find in the supermarket shelf. He has a very rigorous scientific foundation upon which he bases those claims. And then I started looking at other Latin writers of the period who also were trying to explain grandiose, histrionic claims in the Bible on the basis of natural and rational explanations. And I don't want to read to you quotations from people like Agostino Stucco or Pietro d'Abano. They're in the paper. Those of you who have read it have already seen them, and those of you who are curious afterwards can peruse those passages at your convenience. But the larger point is the one that I want to dwell on, namely, for these Jews who were determined to discover the Garden of Eden, not just to prove that it did exist on the world, but to actually know where it was, the way of understanding what the Garden of Eden meant, and what it looked like, what it smelled like, what it tasted like, was not thinking about grace, was not thinking about theology, was thinking instead about natural philosophy. And again, I already mentioned the concept of a common pool, I think, of ideas in early modern Italy, from which both Catholics and Jews drew. And that's very much the case here. There were a number of texts. This paper only scratches the surface. I tried to be as concise as possible, keeping it to 9,000 words. It at one point swelled to many more, but I cut it down. And we can find a number of other Italian writers, Catholic or Jewish, doing very much the same thing. And so at a sort of fundamental level, I want to make a point that's very familiar to those of you who know the history of Jews in modern Italy and early modern Italy as well, namely, that even though someone may have chose to write in Hebrew, the sources for that knowledge and the people who informed those ideas may just as easily have been, and in fact were simply as often Christians as well as they were Jews. So that's not going to electrify anybody. It's a sort of principle and an axiomatic fact about this period, but I do nevertheless want to underscore it. Second, and related, Hebrew literature of this period, and this plugs into my work more broadly, not just this particular paper, was open to a number of new approaches wherever they may lead. So even though Maimonides is great justification for this claim that there's a natural foundation for explaining Eden in this way, as I said, that quotation was buried, and it was not the dominant interpretation. So even though the corpus of medieval Jewish writing didn't necessarily dictate that conclusion, still people like Saltaro, da Pisa, Sforno, and so forth were happy to let it lead them wherever it did. Now, another question, the third and final point I want to make in terms of the broad structure of this paper, is that this does not, and I want to be unambiguous, this does not initiate any kind of secularizing movement. To say that a biblical episode can be explained rationally, and can be explained with natural philosophy, for example, does not drain the Bible of sacrality. It does not limit the idea of an omniscient text that comes straight from God. It's simply a way of investing it with more meaning. And so a temptation for many scholars, I think, of the early modern period is to presume that if early modern intellectuals are using very sharp tools to dissect the biblical corpus, as it were, there's going to be a lot of bleeding and potentially a loss of life. But in reality, what they were doing is exactly the opposite. They were trying to use modern-day discoveries, modern-day science, modern-day understanding to enrich their reading of the Bible and to make themselves firmer in their faith. I'll tell you a quick anecdote apropos of this that doesn't come from this project, but is very relevant. And with this, I will close and open it up for questions. Sometime in the 1560s or 1570s, the Venetian physician David de Pomi, another Jew, was walking through the marketplace in Venice. And as he put it, he brushed up against people who had been infected with the plague. And he said, immediately I feel the infestation of that sickness upon me. And all of us can think about our own friends or parents or associates who are hypochondriacs, and that certainly is what Dipami sounds like. And so what does he do? He casts a glance onto his finger, where there lay a ring embedded with the Tarshish stone. And Tarshish is one of the 12 stones in the high priest's breastplate listed in Exodus 20. And Dipami believed not that he had a derivative of the Tarshish stone, but that he actually had a Tarshish stone. And so what did that mean? It meant that when he looked at it, all of a sudden, the infestation of those poisonous vapors left his body and evaporated from him, and he was restored to perfect health. So sometimes when I tell this story, either in formal talks or in casual conversation, people say, well, he's just obviously nuts, and why do you even tell that story? It's whatever it is, it's just ridiculous. And what I like to point out to people is two things. First of all, there have been a number of very rigorous studies of the placebo effect in the 20th century, right? Not just in the last 3 or 4 years, but in the last 50 or 60 years. And we know a lot about how if people believe they are going to be healed by something, they will be. Two, it shows, I think, not only Dipami's tremendous faith in the Bible as a liturgical text, as a spiritual guide, but also as a text that could solve health problems, like the plague. And also, I think it reminds us that for people in the Renaissance, there was no distance between them and the world of the Bible. Our own modern society is predicated on the belief that whether you're thinking about Jesus in the New Testament or the patriarchs in the Old Testament, a tremendous gulf exists between us and them. And that, in a sense, is a legacy of the Enlightenment and the high criticism of German scholars like Wellhausen in the 19th century. However, in the 16th century, whether it's a scholar like David Dipami or Judah Saltaro, or the people I discussed who are writing about the Garden of Eden, they believe, and I have to emphasize this once more in closing, that not only was it not a fiction, but it existed and it could be found. And that's what I was trying to discuss today. Thank you for your attention.
So we have about 40 or so minutes for conversation, questions, and Andrew can go into more depth in particular parts of the paper, given that we know that not everyone has necessarily read it. But if there are questions, would you feel you want to repeat them?
Sure. I could have spoken for longer, by the way, but I much prefer to hear from you, and I may expatiate after you ask questions.
So, why don't you call on those?
Sir in the blue shirt,
if they believe that the Garden of Eden physically existed at that time, how do they reconcile the biblical account of the flood which destroyed the earth and the Garden of Eden still being there?
Right. Very good question. The short answer is that the flood did not destroy everything. The slightly longer answer is that because Eden was elevated, and descriptions of the garden, not in Genesis, but in virtually every other classical text going into the Middle Ages, discuss it as being on the lofty heights. And for example, Emmanuel of Rome, the great Italian Jewish poet of the High Middle Ages, the first thing he says about paradise is that it's elevated, which is clearly a Dantean vision of coming up into something. So because of its altitude, in short, it was spared by the flood. Marianne?
Yes, it's really a beautiful paper with the interdisciplinary approach and the integrating of various materials, and I found particularly convincing that descriptions of the New World with its lush fruit trees was affecting this literature and giving them a model. And I'm wondering about maps as well. I mean, last summer I got to go to the Hereford Mappamundi with the paradise there, and they're already, certainly in the later dates here, having some illustrated versions of Ptolemy, and there's quite a few maps locating paradise. So could you talk about the influence of that tradition?
Yeah, absolutely. Todd very kindly pointed out in his introduction that I do look at maps. I do. I didn't use any per se in this study, but here's a little something that indicates I do sometimes look at maps. Throughout the Middle Ages, paradise, or Eden, was depicted on a different, literally on a different plane in these maps. So you would have a sort of Mercator-type projection. The Mercator projection is a phenomenon of the 1570s, but before that, you had a view of the continents roughly as we see them today, and then off in a corner, off in the lower left or the lower right, you would see paradise, and there'd be this little image of a hill, possibly with a tiny Adam and a tiny Eve, and two trees, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life, and so on and so forth, and it was often surrounded with some kind of inscription, or a sign of who the cartographer was who drew it, so forth. In the Renaissance, something happens, precisely at the time when the Earth is better understood and more thoroughly mapped. the Garden of Eden ceases to have its own removed place, and instead becomes pictured on the map as if it were a physical place, as if it were a continent. So why does that happen? You would think it would be just the opposite, right? That since people know more and more about the world, they aren't finding paradise. But truly the reverse happens. And modern cartographers have a really appropriate way of addressing that. They talk about the difference between phenomenon representations and concept representations. And phenomenon representations are what we are all familiar with, whether Africa is shrunken or expanded to illustrate its lesser role or its greater role, and we've all seen those kinds of maps. Those are phenomenon representations. But concept representations are key to the way pre-modern people put their maps together. That is to say, they were determined to project their preconceived ideas of the world onto pictorial or visual representations of it. And that's, again, very hard for us to wrap our minds around because we all believe, I think we all believe, that Eden is something metaphysical or theological, or at the very least, that it existed in the past and not in the present. Whereas those in the Renaissance, perhaps because of advanced map-making techniques, were determined to locate it in a fixed place. Yes?
I was wondering how free will came into place in the Garden of Eden. Didn't God want to destroy the Garden of Eden so that man could then not have, free will would no longer be
Yeah, I think that's a nice continuation of the first question from the gentleman here in the blue shirt. In short, I can't qualify on the theological debates about God's intentions in the classical sources. What I can tell you is that in the medieval sources, people like Maimonides are unambiguous about the fact that even though God drove man out of the garden, he intends to bring him back, and he intends to reveal the location of the garden to everybody. So even though there may have been a belief that there was a reason men were expelled, nevertheless, someday they're going to come back due to their merit or due to the grace and generosity of God himself. Yeah, Mr. Viterbi.
Yeah, I'm wondering, mentioned on page 21, the influence of Dante's Fertility. And I'm wondering whether it occurred in the early part of the 16th century because that was a time of peace and relative tranquility, which then was destroyed later in the century. Assuming that to be true, then wouldn't there have also been a period when Dante's Inferno would have had more influence on thought, particularly Jewish writers?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I had been speaking with Massimo Ciavolella, professor of Italian in the back row there, about this very issue. Namely, I was under the somewhat ignorant assumption that people had a continuous knowledge of Dante from the time Dante wrote up to the fascist reforms of Italian education in the early 20th century. Whereas Massimo put me straight, and he said that's not entirely the case, and there were times in which Dante was not as well known, was not lectured about, was not commented upon. Nevertheless, I believe, on the basis of my investigation of this period, that certain well-known bits of Dante, certainly vast chunks of the Inferno, and places in Purgatory and Paradise that imagine paradise, such as this one, were known. Now, as far as a possible degradation or lessening of the fortunes of Europe in the late 16th century, I think that's spot on. I think that the wars of religion in France exerted a disastrous influence on Italian politics as well. Epidemiological problems were unprecedented. By the time we get to the early 17th century, up to a third of northern Italy's population is killed in the plague of 1629, 1630, and so forth. And so, yes, I think that at certain times you're absolutely right. The Inferno would have been more popular than at other times when a more optimistic vision of the world was popular. Your question also puts me in mind of something else. Namely, people sometimes say to me, what was wrong with this world that caused them to think so carefully and to fantasize as they did about this alternative world where perfumes blow from scented flowers and the produce will keep you alive forever? And I don't know yet. I haven't put my finger on it. But what your question makes me realize is that it has to be looked into more. And there's obviously a present-day impulse that is causing people to fantasize about a better time and to put aside images of death, destruction, punishment, and so on and so forth. So it's something that I need to continue with, and I'm very glad that you signaled that to me. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Well, from my recollection of Dante and his opus, despite having drawn and having thorough knowledge of the Hebrew and the Torah tradition and the stories, heaven is definitely not a physical realm. It is one of light and music and no physical suffering. It is not one that is as sensual as the Jewish world. So that Italians really saw heaven, all three states as psychic and emotional states of hell, purgatory, and heaven. Whereas, obviously, the Jewish thought is much more physical.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for that. I'm certainly not a Dante scholar, and so I'm not qualified to say how corporeal versus how theoretical these images are. However, I think if we broaden our lens a little bit and look at other texts in this canon, for example, Piccolomini's Dialogue on a Dream, which I also quote in this paper, and in other places too, you can see that the vision of paradise, the vision of Eden, is very much a physical one. And so even though theologically it might have been a place that existed in time, or it might be a place that people go to in the distant future, for many of these writers, Jewish or Catholic alike, Eden was very much a physical place, and that's what I hope these quotations attest to.
Well, he was the most powerful thinker of his period, and all three states, hell, purgatory, and heaven, exist contemporaneously in the individual, and he achieves by purifying his spiritual self, not by healing his body. Of course, the punishment is an ill body.
Okay. I would just say quickly that Dante certainly was the most popular thinker of his day, but his day was 3 centuries in the past. And so by the time we get to the 16th century, Dante doesn't disappear, but he is supplemented and augmented by a number of other writers who have a much more physical understanding of the nature of paradise.
Plus, Italy lends itself to the physical image of the lushness of its produce to the illusion of heaven.
Indeed.
And since Caravaggio's paintings and,
Yes, no, indeed it does. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I'm puzzled by the question of Methuselah and Abraham and why they lived so long. But they weren't living in Eden. People had been expelled from Eden. They're in a different zip code, by the way. Now, how does the carryover effect work? I think there's a bit of fudging going on.
Yeah. Thank you. I think they are in a different zip code, there is a bit of fudging, but two things come immediately to mind. One is this passage in Stucco, where he says, oh wait, I might have cut this out of the paper. I'm very glad you asked this, because it's not on the paper. Stucco says at one point, if the world Adam lived in was so different, then how could he have been expelled? Maybe it is in the paper. How could he be, someone nod if this sounds familiar. If the world Adam came from was fundamentally a different one, then how could he have been expelled into our world? That is to say, this wasn't some kind of Battleship Galactica scenario where he comes from another universe and enters this one, right? So because he had to come from somewhere relatively proximate, then the conditions, climatological, meteorological, vegetal, were similar. So that's certainly one explanation. And then second, this is taken up in some of the medieval sources that I'm familiar with. So for example, in Maimonides and Nachmanides, they talk about how this microclimate isn't unique only to Eden, but spread slightly. So there's always a way of sort of squirreling around those kinds of problems, and this is something that theologians and natural philosophers are very good at in this period. But you're absolutely right, to our minds it's a problem, and it probably should be sharpened in the subsequent version of this paper. Yes, in the blue shirt.
Are there, in the quotation on page 9 by Sforno, when he talks about the deterioration in the air and produce, are there writings in this of that era as to the extent of industrial pollution?
That's a great question. Not that I know of. There's no prefiguration of post-industrial dystopias that we're familiar with. There are discussions about environmental policy, though. For example, Venice is a city that not only lives on shipping and trade and commerce, but is also physically built on, I kid you not, millions of trees that were placed in the lagoon to prop up the city itself. And recently there's a wonderful book by a scholar called Karl Apun called I forget what it's called, but it's about Venice, and it's about how important environmental policy was to its political policy.
The Forest of the Sea.
Forest on the Sea. I cited it, but I forgot.
What's it called?
It's called The Forest on the Sea.
Of the sea.
Yeah. So does that mean, though, that there was no anxiety about unhealthy living conditions? Of course not. Many of these people were very urban dwellers, and the conditions of European cities at the time ranged from what we would consider to be kind of distasteful to absolutely noxious. And that means cramped living quarters, no disposal of human waste, anything that we would consider proper or civilized at all. And now that situation hadn't changed from late antiquity, really. But even so, were there people who were particularly sensitive to olfactory pollution or to spreading of germs or so on and so forth? I think we can reasonably assume yes.
So I wanted to go back to Miriam's question, and I was always intrigued by this idea that paradise moves from the periphery of the map as this kind of go place, assuming a utopian paradise as a go place, to the center of the map at some point. I wonder if there's a parallel thing going on with, as the world becomes, so to speak, more known, you have the periphery of the map also changing. So you no longer have beasts and alligators and so forth. I imagine they also go away, probably on the same time that paradise goes in the middle. I wonder if it actually has to do with ways of knowing the world and the confidence of that knowledge in a graphic, symbolic form. And if so, then what that would mean, in terms of what this basically means to take paradise and make it something knowable, central, and the world itself as kind of evacuated of perhaps the unknown.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that while some of these mythological, poisonous, rapacious beasts do recede from the frontiers and from the maps altogether, in very well-known images, and Marianne knows this stuff, I think, at least as well as I do, you still see them. For example, in the frontispiece of Francis Bacon's The Great Instauration, you see very clearly the pillars, you see a ship sailing through it, you see a biblical quotation that says, many will pass to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased, right? But even there, if you look beyond the pillars, you see some kind of fire-breathing dragon taking a little turn in the water. So it's not until really closer to the Enlightenment, later in the 17th and to the 18th century, that people stop believing that wild beasts populate the seas. And even in the 19th century, with Melville's vision of a whale, I would argue, there's still a sort of deep-seated fear that the ocean is very unknowable. Even today, you can watch National Geographic specials about how the ocean is truly the last frontier, not outer space. As far as solid knowledge, though, in paradise, which I think was the kernel of your question, I think that's exactly it. And that the best way to understand how these people come to see paradise as physical, as natural, and so on and so forth, is by relating that to an increased knowledge of the world. And that's what I was trying to show, not with visual sources, of course, but with literary ones, in terms of Peter Martyr's description of what he saw in the West Indies, or any of the other explorers and sailors and expeditioners that I was studying. So there's certainly a very tight connection between accuracy in mapping, more knowledge and information, and then a tendency to see paradise not as fantastical, but actually real. Yeah. Yes, you in the back, sir.
At the beginning, you told that at the time of the Renaissance, educated people tried to connect Bible and science and myth. Then you talk about some connections with myth. What do you know about connections to science? Between Bible, Torah, and science. At that time.
Okay. Yeah. I'm struggling to answer because, on the one hand, so many clear things come to mind, like Copernican theory and the collapse of the Ptolemaic model of the universe, but I can't tell if you're asking me to discuss those kinds of issues in the Bible. Sorry?
Connections, not what happened in science or what happened in Bible study, but what connections people at that time found between what's written in the Bible and what was discovered by science.
Okay, and I can't speak about medicine. let me speak about medicine, and then if that's not satisfactory, I'll come up with something else. I'll tell another anecdote from the period. Two students who were in my class last semester have already heard this, so they can plug their ears or do something else. In the early 17th century, the Mantuan Jewish physician Abraham Portaleone was fascinated with the material culture of the biblical world. And he wrote an entire encyclopedia, which he dedicated to his sons. He wrote it in Hebrew. And the point of this encyclopedia, which is called Shildei HaGiborim, or the Shields of the Mighty, was to give them the proper kavanah, or intention, focus, devotion when they prayed. To his mind, the way his sons would come upon a deeper focus in their prayer was not by visualizing God or God's attributes or the sphirot and Kabbalistic thought. On the contrary, it was by understanding what the temple itself looked like, smelled like, how it was built, how the animals were sacrificed, so on and so forth. He devotes 11 chapters in this book, which is over 12% of the entire encyclopedia, to the incense mixture that the high priest sacrificed on the altar. And he was convinced, through advances in botanical knowledge, through his own experiments with botany, and through new plants that had been discovered in the New World and brought back to Italy, that he could not only identify each element of the incense mixture, but also build it. And he did so in the face of very stiff rabbinic proscriptions. The penalty, by the way, for reconstructing the incense mixture is spiritual death, or karet. So it's not something to be taken lightly, but he finds a very clever way of weaving around that. Point being that he does this not only to allow his sons to have a more intimate acquaintance with the Bible, but also to cure sicknesses, because he believed that virtually every sacrifice, every scent, every product in the temple had a salubrious function. So a response to contemporary epidemiological problems, for example, is not necessarily Hellenic medicine, just the opposite. The response to contemporary epidemiological problems could be biblical science, and there's a connection between the Diplomi anecdote I told before about the ring and the magic stone, and this episode involving incense. So I hope that helps with the science-Bible connection a little bit. This gentleman first, and then back to you, Marianne. Yeah.
Yes, it's a very, very interesting topic. This I'm intrigued at what seems to be a kind of absence at the moment, and that is the musicological and astrological dimensions. And I'm thinking of obviously people like Ficino and the 15th century Florentines who really pioneered kind of New Age, what we think of as kind of New Age medicine, but primarily on the basis of an analysis of Platonic harmonics and also a profound sense that the stars were only intelligible in terms of musical ratios and so forth. And you couldn't acquire physical health without mental health. You couldn't acquire mental health without spiritual health in a special sense of spirit as the medium of music and of astrological light and of astrological influence.
Yeah.
Is this just simply not broached in your text, or is it simply an absent presence?
Or have I ignored it? It's another question. A word about Neoplatonism and the issues you brought up, and then a direct response to the question. The word about Neoplatonism is that, as you very cogently said, there are connections between musical ratios and planetary movements, and this is all based on a vision of the world of the universe as animistic, as the sublunar realm is the only corruptible one, and the supralunar realm is the one that is uncorruptible, right? And with mechanic philosophy of the 17th century, Descartes and his successors and students, so forth, this view of the world collapses. However, one of its last flowerings can be seen in the work of a brilliant and very, very quirky German Jesuit called Athanasius Kircher, whose work forms the subject of a very fascinating exhibition at the Museum of Jurassic Technology here in Culver City. So if any of you have not been to the Museum of Jurassic Technology, or have heard of it and would like to go, or have not heard of it, I think that it's well worth a visit, and you can see that among Kircher's various projects was one in which he built a musical device that was meant to channel celestial melodies down into the sublunar realm, and that he did many things. In addition, I could talk for 15 minutes about Kircher, and I won't. All that is to say that he lived in the 17th century and was not dead by any means with Descartes' publication, right? Back to these authors. They are not Neoplatonists. I have not plucked these quotations from the context of Ficino-like investigations and tried to hide that. They simply aren't. That said, there were Jews at the time who were Neoplatonists. I think first and foremost about someone like Yochanan Alemano, whom Fabrizio Lelli, a former Viterbi scholar here at UCLA, has studied very carefully and with much energy and insight. And there were other, especially 15th century Italian Jewish scholars who were very much in the mold of Neoplatonism. However, these scholars, whether they were physicians, whether they were amateur geographers, whether they were biblical exegetes, saw things very differently. And they weren't necessarily subscribing to a notion of an animistic universe where ratios were what was key. Instead, they were using what I've employed this sort of baggy term, rational or naturalistic, but I'm going to use it again, explanations to explore biblical phenomena such as Eden. So that is, in short, what the gentleman describes is very much part of the culture of Renaissance and early modernity for sure, but it is conspicuously absent in the works of these people. Yes, sir?
You take it as a given that they assumed healthy eating is fruits and vegetables, like modern vegetarians. I suspect, given their eating habits, meat would be the thing they would pick as healthy eating, because that's what kept them alive. That's what very few of them ate. And that was the desirable food.
Sure.
I think you're projecting modern thinking on these Renaissance people.
You're right, I am. They were all carnivores. And here's a case where I have selected something. I have tried to combine our own present-day fixation with vegetarianism. I'm not one, if you're worried that I am, onto a biblical view, onto a Renaissance view of Eden. That's not what's going on. What's going on is several other, I think, richer things. One is a class issue, right? People eat meat who can afford it, and not everybody can afford meat. It's only a small percentage of the population that can eat meat with any regularity. The rest of the population subsists on fruits and vegetables, and chiefly cheese as their main source of protein. The thing that really exercised the imaginations of these writers was the question of ratios and proportion. Not in a Neoplatonic sense, I don't think, but rather Ficino, in his 3 books on life, talks about proportions between grains and meats and dairy and eggs and fruits and vegetables. And I forget exactly what they are, but there is a foundation, so to speak, that one should have of fruits and vegetables. We think of the recent USDA food pyramid, which until a year or two ago was based on grains and carbohydrates at the bottom, and now we know we want to turn the pyramid onto its head. So you're absolutely right. Thank you for causing me to retract a little bit and correct my statement. It's not incipient vegetarianism. It is, however, and this I won't back down from, it is a newfangled and I think very important emphasis on healthful eating, whether that's carnivorous, omnivorous, or vegetarian. Yes?
To start with your question, in the biology, in the story of creation of the world, we are taught to eat mostly trees, from the trees, fruits from the trees, vegetables. There aren't any animals are mentioned, so we don't have to, we are not carnivorous necessarily. It can be also vegetarian already in ancient times. Now, rabbinical sources also have description of Garden of Eden, and they mention fish, for example. And we have done meal, man meal, most important meal to be consumed when you reach that level, to reach the Garden of Eden. Yeah. And also, although in the Bible, the story of Garden of Eden ends with Adam being expelled out of here, and that's it, as if no way to come back. But some in the Jewish sources, Adam and you do go back to Garden of Eden after repenting and asking forgiveness from God, and they live every ever after. Right. And Garden of Eden was gone. Right. So there are all kinds of variations in sources. Probably the rabbis in Italy, I'm sure they were one of them.
I'm sure they were, and that's a great question. Just in case some of you in the back left couldn't hear him, he, I think, made 2 points, if I can summarize. One was the idea of fish as something that was seen as healthy and a very common final meal, and the Leviathan in the Bible is, of course, some kind of great fish. And the second thing you pointed out was the fact that in some strains of rabbinic thought, the Adam and Eve after the expulsion were repented and were allowed to re-enter the garden. And if so, that seems to possibly indicate either a post-diluvian existence of the garden, or, maybe more generally, a view that they could eventually return to it. Thank you for the question. I think it stands as much as a comment as it does as a question. And just one quick addition. Of course, it won't surprise any of you to hear that along with this investigation of the garden is an investigation of rivers. Why? Because Genesis speaks of 4 rivers flowing into and nourishing the Garden of Eden. And Columbus and many others, as Jeffrey Simcox and his colleagues have taught us, were convinced that when they saw certain rivers in the New World, they were seeing either the Pishon or the Euphrates or one of the other 2 rivers mentioned in Genesis. And some of these authors do talk about the amazing fish that comes out of those rivers. Fish amazing visually, fish amazing in terms of their nutritive properties, and that is certainly another alimentary angle that we should consider, for sure.
2 more short questions, if you don't mind. So do they, in this rabbi information, because it's scholars today, we would assume that the Garden of Eden was in Iraq and Peru. So all of that was really traumatized by the feeling. So that was more like hell than reading. Anyhow, do they mention it on any kind of theoretic work is there's going to be located? And final question, are they influenced by any chance also by the Arab philosophers? And my own is as well, I'm sure. Would they refer to any of the sources of the Russian from 10th century before?
Yeah.
There's one book by Masoudi, Muruj al-Dahab. The whole book is about Northern Eden. So it was Golden Oasis.
I have not heard of that book. I wouldn't put it past the people I've studied to have heard of that book. I'll take the second question first, and then the first question second. With regard to Arab scholars, yes, in short, many of these people were aware of Arab writings on this topic. For example, the Spanish Jesuit Jose Acosta famously sailed from Spain, or perhaps Portugal, I think Spain, to the New World, and as he approached the torrid zone, which is what we think of as the equatorial regions, he describes in his journal being terrified and thinking that he was going to start to burn up and combust on the high seas, because in Aristotelian science, human beings cannot live in the equatorial regions because it's simply too hot for them to stand in. So as the ship sails closer and closer, he's getting more and more nervous, and finally the ship reaches the equator and it's cool. He has to reach for a pullover. And he says, all at once I began to laugh at Aristotle and his whole system of cosmography because I knew it was wrong. And then a lot of people cut the quotation right there, and they think, this is the rejection of ancient science, and all of a sudden it's a brave new world and we're sailing past the Pillars of Hercules and everything is just observation and empiricism. The second half of Acosta's quote is, now I know Avicenna was right. Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, the great medieval Arabic physician and scientist, said that the torrid zone was habitable. But not only was it habitable, it was ideal. And it was a temperate climate where great things grew. And that is something that, although the writers I studied in this paper don't explicitly acknowledge, they were certainly aware of, because other contemporary voices knew that just because Aristotle fell, another classical or medieval scholar, in this case of Avicenna, was there to take his place. As far as estimates or notions of where the garden existed, there were a lot of them. And I think I do mention this on page 5. I say that Saltaro reviewed the various and conflicting opinions regarding the garden's location and proposed hypotheses ranging from the West Indies to Madagascar to Mesopotamia, there's Iraq, to present-day Turkey. And there are more, that's just a sampling. And I mentioned Athanasius Kircher a few minutes ago in the context of the Museum of Dressing Technology. I had the pleasure of looking at his Arca Noae, or Noah's Ark, in the Getty Research Institute, and he has 5 to 7 pages where he reviews all of these claims of the location of the Garden of Eden in medieval and Renaissance thought, and that sampling that I just read you comes from Kircher's own pages. So there are a lot of guesses, and yes, Mesopotamia is among them. Marianne?
To get to a topic that isn't in your paper, but I'm really very, very curious about examples for this. The other tradition that views the Garden of Eden as inside our soul, it's expressed best by Philo of Alexandria. I realize his Greek text wasn't available in Hebrew. Ambrose is influenced by it also in some Kabbalistic drawings, and one has this notion of the Setfi Road as a passage upward, and I was really struck that the passage that I like the best in the Renaissance is from a French Hebraicist, Jean Baudin, in his natural philosophy book, and I was struck that you have a lot of examples of scent and the olfactory sensuality of these images, and that's what he talks about. He's using Philo, and he says that the seeds of virtue and knowledge flourish in our mind, and one will feel the scent of this. He is directly using Philo and mentions a bunch of various authors, so it strikes me that it's possible Baudin, late 16th century, has been influenced by some of these authors that you are mentioning. But I guess I'm asking whether you have found also, you're looking at the literal paradise in this chapter, but whether you have found evidence of the garden of the mind, that Eden is a potentiality for human beings to attain goodness and knowledge of good and evil, for instance.
Right. That's a great question. I have not found evidence of it. And I do know that in patristic writings, there are a number of schools of thought. It's not that all the church fathers thought the same thing, of course they didn't. For example, the so-called Antiochian school, those from Antioch, like Epiphanius and John Chrysostom, were propounded allegorical readings of much of Scripture, and especially the garden. There are other voices, like Jerome, most famously, who had a much more literal understanding of what the Bible said and believed that Eden actually existed. So, in the 16th century, representatives of both schools of thought flourished. And I haven't read Baudin's Theatrum Naturae recently enough. If my memory is correct, Anne Blair has a page or two about this in her 1997 book about Baudin, so you could find out. I will say quickly, apropos of this, that the stakes were very high in the 16th century for denying something like Eden's fertility. This is a tiny bit off topic, but not very. The 16th century Swiss reformer, Michael Servetus, was eventually burned at the stake, and he was accused by Calvin and others of a number of heresies. One of his heresies was saying that the land of Israel was sterile. And because much of it wasn't fertilized and irrigated by the rivers there, it was actually not a very good place to grow anything. And so he made this comment, not I think out of any nastiness or any bias against that part of the world, but just based on what he saw, what he read about its topography and geology, and then he was burned at the stake. So making claims about biblical places, whether they exist in the present day or existed in the past, was something that was very dangerous to do. And even though none of these Italian scholars, who seem to have been much more rooted, so to speak, in physical realities, did that, that doesn't mean there weren't voices, for example, Protestants, who were keen to use allegorical interpretations or were keen to deny notions of Eden's fertility or the land of Israel's fertility. So I'll stop there.
Well, here's some other possibilities, like the unusual paintings discovered at Dura Europos, in which a tree rises up from the Torah in the earlier version, that kind of imagery, Psalm 1, with the righteous man being compared to a tree. This kind of horticulture culture, does that bring up any passages that you've been reading, or any knowledge of Philo's allegory of Genesis?
None to my knowledge. Joanna Weinberg, I think who gave the inaugural Viterbi lecture here some years ago, has an article about Philo's resurfacing in the 16th century, and I can give you a citation to that. So I don't know enough precisely about Philo and in this period, but again, I think that if one has to make a guess about the existence of intellectual trends in the Renaissance, one should just say yes, they existed, because it was such an energetic and active time that the more one looks, the more one can find. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were Jewish writers who had understandings like that one.
But expect these people with their literal image to stick to that all this.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. The two of you have both already spoken, so ma'am first.
Is it fair to state that Garden of Eden and Paradise are not interchangeable in order to differentiate the kind of experience one has in either one?
Yes, I think it is. I think that Christian scholars tend to use the two interchangeably. Jewish scholars, when they write in Hebrew, perhaps for lexical reasons as much as interpretive ones, tend to say the Garden of Eden. And so in an earlier version of this paper, I used them as virtually synonymous. And then as I went along, I tried to be much more punctilious about which expression that I was using. And so again, to summarize, for Christians in this period, they can be fairly interchangeable. for Jews, the notion of paradise as a sort of flexible concept that could be both terrestrial paradise or heavenly paradise doesn't apply. We simply have the Garden of Eden that's terrestrial, the Garden of Eden that's metaphysical.
Well, because paradise tends to be more metaphysical, and that is what Dante, titled his last book, Paradise, and it's not Garden of Eden.
Right. True. But I don't think that Saltaro titled his book Sefer Shaharei Gan Eden, and so he, as well as these other Jewish writers, were very much focused on the notion of the Garden of Eden / paradise as being physical and terrestrial. Yeah, sir.
This may be a little off topic, but you were talking about the cross-fertilization of Christian and Jewish thinkers of the time. Do you know, was there any attempt by Christian physicians or theologians to use natural science to explain some of the miraculous things, let's say, of Jesus' life? Having done autopsies and seen what happened to bodies after death, did they try and explain how wounds could heal, not leave a scar, be a perfect, resurrection?
Great question. Many of them do. I can point you to a massive body of scholarship addressing that question, which we can talk about later if you'd like. They certainly do. Jews obviously aren't interested in Jesus and the stigmata and the resurrection or explaining it medically, but for sure, Christian physicians are very keen to do that. Something curious happens, though. In the Renaissance, this is a very comfortable and welcome synthesis of two different fields of knowledge, right? We can use our medicine and our science to explicate Scripture. However, in the 17th century, it starts to become a little bit dangerous. And I'm thinking, for example, of the English scholar Thomas Brown, who in his Religio Medici, or the religion of the physician, talks about asking what the composition of this same incense mixture that I spoke about in response to his question a few minutes ago was, right? What were the elements of it? And he presents this intellectual operation as one that the devil tempted him into doing. And so, according to his train of thought, the devil tempted me to inquire after the natural foundations of the incense mixture. If I keep doing this, then all of Scripture will immediately or eventually become explicable, and there'll be no such thing as a miracle, which by definition is something that goes contrary to the laws of nature. So that becomes an increasingly tense and fraught operation in the 17th century. In the 16th century, which is one of the reasons why I think it's so fascinating to study, different systems of thought can sit very comfortably side by side and interdigitate, to use a very 20th century word. Whereas in the 17th century and leading up to the Enlightenment, it becomes more and more dangerous and unappealing to do that.
We can adjourn to a small group conversation and finish up lunch. So.